Good morning, good day, and good evening. I'm, as always, your host, Brody Robertson, and today we have the developer of something that doesn't get made very often, a independent web browser. There's a couple of them, but most things you see out there are just Chrome. Sometimes they're Firefox, but they're usually Chrome. So, welcome to the show. How about you introduce yourself, talk about the project you do, and we can go from there.
Sure. Well, hello, friends. My name is Andreas Kling. I am the founder and lead developer of the Ladybird browser project. Um, and before that, I was the founder and lead developer of the SerenityOS project. And before that, I was a humble engineer at the Apple computer company. But I've been doing browsers for a very long time. And ever since 2005, I think I made my first browser contribution to KHTML, the KDE browser back in the day, because they added ad block to it, and you had to reload the page for new filters to take effect. And I thought that was terrible. They should take effect right away. So that's why I got into browser development. I think it was something like that. Anyway, yes, I've been doing browsers my whole career, essentially, just bouncing around different companies, and now I am building a new browser from scratch. And there's a lot of history to that. Brody, I'll let you decide how deep we go into that.
I think before we even go into that, I kind of want to touch on the KHTML thing because this is something I like to bring up every so often because it's a fun little bit of knowledge that most people don't have. KHTML is kind of the basis for most of what we have on the web today. Like WebKit and Blink both stemmed out of that project. I don't think most people even consider that.
That's true. Yeah, it started like quite a long time ago. I think in 1998 or something like that. KHTML.
Yeah, it sounds about
Um,
right.
they just wanted an HTML viewer widget for KDE, and this guy Lars put one together, and eventually it just kept growing and growing. And Apple secretly picked it up without telling anybody and used it as the basis for what became Safari and what eventually became Chrome as well.
Mhm.
And if you go and look in the code for Safari and Chrome, both of them still have a lot of those old KDE copyrights from like 98, 99.
I
Pretty cool.
believe that a lot of the WebKit browsers still have KHTML in the user agent string as well, if I recall correctly.
Yes, I believe they do. User agent strings are an interesting
Yeah.
thing. um, and it's like this pain that just never goes away. And
Mhm.
we are facing it every day now that we're building a new browser
Mm.
because, contrary to what you should be doing, a lot of websites are checking the user agent string and making decisions based on that.
Mhm.
Um, so you just kind of have to put a bunch of crap in there that's not true. So we are stubbornly right now not saying KHTML, not saying Apple WebKit, not saying Chrome or anything like that in our user agent string. And it means that we are not allowed on websites like x.com and many others.
Mhm.
Um, and I've tried to plead with multiple engineers over there, but the they all say that they're going to look into it, and then nothing happens.
Mhm.
So I don't know, but it's kind of a losing battle, because even if you could get a hold of somebody at the major websites, there's still like thousands and thousands of websites out there
Right.
that nobody's maintaining. They're just running in a server in a closet somewhere, and they check the user agent, and you're just screwed.
Mhm.
So yeah. Anyway,
For anyone who might not know what a user agent is, what just can you briefly go over that and what
right,
is it
right.
supposed to be used for, and what are websites actually doing with it?
Right. Sorry. Yeah. So a user agent string is it's sort of a branding that a browser has, and any website can ask, "Hey, what is your name, Mr. Browser?" And the browser will then say who he is. And it's also included in every outgoing HTTP request. You include like, "Hey, I would like your index.html, and my name is Mr. Safari," or whatever.
Mhm.
And websites then look at this and they make these annoying decisions like, Oh, well, if you are Safari, then surely you want this CSS and this JavaScript because
Mhm.
I know they work in Safari. I tested that 15 years ago. Um, and there's just a lot of that. And
Mhm,
so
mhm.
when we come along and we say that, hey, we are Ladybird, there are a bunch of websites out there that just throw up their hands and they're like,
Unsupported
uh,
browser.
unsupported browser, or here's something we made for IE users in the 90s.
Mhm.
Maybe you can use that. Um, and it's often hard to tell. Like unsupported browser is almost like a best case scenario because then you know at least that they checked the user agent and they decided that it's no good.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, the worst case scenario is where they just send you something slightly different than what everybody else is getting, but you have no idea that that's happening. We
Right,
get a lot of
right.
that. Yeah.
Do you happen to have an example of some difference you might see there?
Uh, well, it's usually a lot about like they're trying to work around known bugs in
Mm,
certain browser versions. So they might know, for example, that um, Safari 13 shipped with like this bug in JavaScript iteration that if you're iterating over all of these properties, then something goes wrong. And so they have sort of a version of the code that avoids that feature,
mhm, mhm.
and then they ship that to perhaps specific Safari users or perhaps to everybody that they don't recognize. Or, um, but it's generally not sort of visual things that differ, but you just get like a slightly different version of the program, like a
Mm.
hacked local version, if that makes sense. Um, it's a very strange problem, actually.
Yeah, my understanding of JavaScript, like I haven't done a ton of web dev in a while, is especially a lot of the older versions where we had a lot of the giant web stack we have now to do any sort of basic web development. Implementations tended to differ of JavaScript between browsers. So you would have these, like, this is sort of the reason why things like jQuery came along, to sort of just abstract away a lot of that annoyance, let the library do it, and then the developer can just focus on that. Because without that, then you have to, this is how we got into the situation where you had sites that only supported IE because Microsoft was so big that they were in the situation that Google's in now, where if they just want to change the spec, who's gonna stop them? Like, they can.
Yeah, that was definitely a thing. And I would even credit JavaScript frameworks as one of the big contributors to why it's relatively easy to build a new browser today.
Mhm,
Because if they hadn't come and just sort of flattened the landscape and put an abstraction layer on top of these incompatible engines, um, we would still be dealing with sort of different behaviors today, perhaps.
mhm.
But it was many things that contributed to it. Like the specifications improved as well. Like the standards bodies decided, hey, we should make the standards
Be a standard
reflect what
body.
browsers do.
Right.
Um, and yeah, there was a lot of synergy that happened in the browser industry, and
Mhm,
we are now sort of benefiting at the tail end of that because nowadays their standards are good. They match what browsers do for the most part. There are all these frameworks that abstract away most of the slightly sort of different idiosyncrasies of different browsers, um, and what you're left with is just like a handful of boutique problems, such as people checking the user agent string. Uh,
mhm.
so it's like it's better than it's ever been, but it's still annoying.
Right.
Um, and at the end of this whole thing, what's going to happen, whether we like it or not, is that we're going to have to start saying, we are Ladybird, or are we Chromium? Perhaps a little bit of WebKit, maybe
Mhm.
HTML. Don't worry about it. Just send us something,
Right, right.
because that's what everybody ends up having to do.
Yeah. You have a lot of these browsers that are, especially the ones that are based on another toolkit, and they just say, well, like, I'm the Zen browser. Well, no, I'm actually Firefox. You don't need to know what Zen is. Just send me whatever Firefox is, or I think Brave just says it's Chromium. I don't think it actually has Brave in the user agent string. I might be mistaken there, but a lot of I know Vivaldi, for example, just says I'm just Chromium. Just send me Chromium. Like, don't worry about anything else, because yeah, as you said, you start running into these just oddities that frankly you don't need to deal with. And it would be nice if we didn't have this user agent string here, and it was just like a thing that could be done away with, but
Yeah.
yeah.
In a way, building a browser is almost like building a bootleg video game console.
Mm,
Um, that there are all these games out there, and they are just made for sort of the big consoles, right? And they maybe relying on something that isn't documented in the official PlayStation documentation or whatever.
mm,
But because the Sony PlayStation does a certain thing, then it's just expected that we do that as well. Um, so I don't know. I like to draw comparisons between game consoles and browsers because it's it's very similar as it turns out. And it might just be because I've built a lot of emulators. And it's just logical to draw the comparison.
mhm, mhm.
Um, but yeah, uh, browsers are big emulators, and the web is just a big ROM collection.
Mm. I've never heard
That's
anyone describe it like that before.
it is kind of my mental model, and it's also the workflow is very similar because when you're building a game console, you have some game that you want to play,
Mm,
and then you're kind of just hacking on your emulator until you can see something happening in that game.
mm,
You're
mhm,
not worried about, like Donkey Kong racing or whatever. You're just trying to get Mario 64 to work.
mm, mhm,
Um, and so you're sort of building whatever's necessary for that specific thing.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and then you end up with something that's like capable of doing a lot of things that make that one thing work really well. But then somebody comes along and they throw a different game into it, and turns out, oh, we have to do all these other things.
mhm.
And this is almost entirely how we've built Ladybird so far, is that people just try their own favorite websites and then decide that, oh, I'm going to make this work better. Um, or well, at least that's how we used to build it until we became a bit more test driven a
Right.
year ago or so.
I do definitely want to get into that, but I think we should get into more of just like the foundational of what the browser is first, and we can come back to that a bit later. So
Absolutely.
I guess the best place to start is what is the Ladybird browser? Like that, maybe that's a very broad question to go with. I think you know what? Let's start with why is it not based on any existing engine? Why are you sorry, my I trip over words sometimes. Why are you building an engine from scratch? Why are you not, doing what everybody else does and using something that's already out there?
Mm. So the reason for that has sort of evolved over time.
Mhm,
When we started on it, we just wanted a rich text display widget for SerenityOS. I wanted to be able to have bold and italic fonts in different sizes on
mhm,
the same on the same line. Um, so it was very humble in the beginning.
mhm,
But being an old browser developer, it just sort of predictably spiraled into, if I implemented this little piece of HTML, I might as well also add CSS, and I might add these other features. And why don't I put a JavaScript engine in it?
mhm, mhm,
Um, and in the beginning, it was just motivated by that, like just building a rich text widget for Serenity OS. And I guess it was maybe 6 months into it or something like that, where I started realizing that we should probably just call this a browser at this point because that's what it's evolving into.
mhm, mhm,
Um, and then it became more about like, let's see how far we can go, how far we can take it before we hit some kind of, I don't know, like insurmountable friction. Um, and that day just never came, and we just kept pushing and improving it. And eventually, what happened was that it was originally part of the Serenity OS project. So
mhm,
Serenity OS is a mono repo with like all kinds of applications and a kernel and user land and everything developed in one Git repository.
mhm, mhm.
And what happened was we started building this browser, and eventually it was um, most of the daily development in the repo was just browser related, and it sort of
Right.
overshadowed the rest of the operating system in terms of activity. And um, I decided that it would be better to fork the project at that point,
Mhm,
so that people who wanted to work on an operating system, do kernel stuff, they could live in peace in the Serenity repo, and they
Mhm.
wouldn't have to worry about people like asking them to run all the browser tests whenever they were making changes,
Right.
and vice versa. Like people working on CSS, they don't necessarily want to run device driver tests in the kernel if they're making changes.
Mhm.
Um, so it grew out of that, and once we forked, then we started changing changing the rules, I guess, that were sort of established for SerenityOS, where
Mm.
the rules in SerenityOS were we build everything from scratch
Right.
ourselves, everything at home, no matter what. And when Ladybird was free to be its own thing, we decided that, we are just going to incorporate some popular open source libraries and not worry so much about implementing stuff like cryptography, compression, video codecs, stuff
Right.
like
Right.
that.
Right.
Stuff that's like far outside of our expertise that we were doing for fun, but not doing the best job of optimizing.
Right, and stuff.
Um,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
Stuff that somebody else probably has written much better than you will. So
right.
just do their stuff.
Exactly, exactly. And so it just sort of organically evolved towards this point where, okay, well, now like a fledgling open source browser
Mhm.
that leans on some of the best parts of the open source ecosystem. And um, what do we do now? Well, um, why don't we try to push this thing all the way and build a browser people could actually use instead of just toying around with it?
Mhm.
So that sort of became a new motivation. Like, okay, let's build a real browser. Um, and then because of things happening outside of our little microcosm, the browser industry has been sort of consolidating on Chromium, as you mentioned,
Mhm.
in recent years. Like people keep abandoning their browser engines and saying, "Hey, we can just build on top of Chromium,
Well,
and
it's
then we don't have
Chromium
to."
except for all of the
Yeah.
game consoles which are WebKit, which
Hmm.
leads to some. There's a lot of there's a lot of console hacking exploits because of old versions of WebKit they use.
True. True. Uh, Pros and cons to that.
Well, if you use a
uh,
very outdated library and you don't update it, people are going to discover what problems you have with it.
Indeed, indeed. Uh, so, but like with the world around us, um, sadly, sort of giving up on browser engines,
Mhm.
this seemed like, hey, we are in a better position than anybody else to introduce a new browser engine
Mhm.
and add some life to this sort of depressing field, and that became part of our motivation as well. Like, okay, well, let's just build a new browser engine and put it out there, and um, find a place for it. And then I met Chris Wanstroth
Mhm.
in 2023, GitHub co-founder, and he was really into the idea of taking this thing all the way and building a new browser, independent as well. And we talked about like what would be sort of the motivation and the narrative of such a thing. And something that we both agreed on was that it should be independent and not
Mhm.
reliant on um, sort of handouts from the advertising industry, um, because I think that's where the browser industry has gone wrong.
Yeah.
And yeah, and in 2023, that was still a little bit of a sort of inside baseball because the big revelations about how much money Google is giving to browsers, they were not public yet, but it was about to come out. Um, but that was sort of what we um, initially connected about, Chris and I. Like, what if we did something and tried to just find a new way to build and finance a browser,
Mhm.
and now we've integrated that into our motivation. And it's more than just like we don't want to take money from Google.
Mhm.
It's also how do we build something that can be maintained without that level of funding,
Mhm.
right? Because a lot of people ask us like, why don't you just fork an existing browser and then you would be starting in a great place and you can just work from there. And the problem is that the existing browsers are built and maintained by thousands of people, essentially.
Mhm.
and we don't have the budget for that. We have a lot of lovely sponsors, but we have nowhere near enough to hire like 200 people to
Mhm.
maintain and continue to develop one of the existing engines.
Mhm.
So um, we are trying to build a new engine that can actually be maintained on a small budget as well.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and what that looks like in practical terms is that it just has to be a fraction of the size.
Right.
So I think somebody told me the other day that WebKit is around 10 million lines of code, and we are a couple of 100,000 lines of code.
Okay.
Um, Now I don't. If you include libraries, then we are bigger,
Sure.
of course. But I don't think we've broken the 1 million lines
Mhm.
mark yet, and we eventually will if we want to support all the popular web features. But
Sure. Sure.
um, there should be no need to go to 10 million.
Right.
And this is kind of our um, most important specialization from my perspective, from a technical perspective, is how do we build this thing in a way that we can sustain development into the future without becoming dependent on somebody feeding us, $100 million every year.
Mhm.
And that's the actually scary part that nobody's really done, I think.
Right. I do want to get
Um,
more into that, but I want to back up just a little bit to when you're talking
sure.
about building something from scratch with Serenity. Why was it that you guys were doing everything in house? Is it just because you can, or was there like some other reason for it?
It was just to have fun, really.
Fair.
Um, so um, I guess most people who listen to your show probably are familiar with Serenity OS
At
and the
least
backstory,
maybe
but
they haven't looked into it super deeply. I'm sure they've at least heard about the project at least a couple of
right.
times.
Yeah. So the backstory, quick version, is that in 2018,
Mhm.
I had been living with a severe drug problem, and I got into a rehab program. And after completing that, I found myself with just a lot of time um, because I was used to filling my days with drugs and debauchery, and without that, you have, I don't know, like 16 hours in a day. You're supposed to do something else.
Mhm.
Um, and so I just got into, well, I tried a bunch of things, but I got into programming,
Mhm.
which I've done my whole life. And I needed some big project to fill up all that time. And I built a bunch of things and then eventually realized I had built a small kernel, um, what was it, like a kernel, a file system, windowing system, and something else.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I realized that, hey, if I just smush these together, it's basically a GUI operating system. And then I just need to keep working on it.
Mhm.
And so I did that, and that I decided to call it Serenity OS because in rehab we use the Serenity prayer to sort of align ourselves with the idea um, that we have to accept some things in life that we can't change, and we
Mhm.
have to work on the things that are under our control. And I want it to be forever associated with that idea. So I named it that, and that has worked out beautifully because people refer to me all over the world as the Serenity Guy. So uh, plan worked beautifully.
Perfect title. I like that.
So now I can't run away from that.
Mhm.
I'm always reminded. So
Mhm.
that's
Mhm.
it's working out really well. And yeah, the idea was that since I just started working on random stuff and putting it together, um, it just stayed that way. Whenever somebody wanted to add something, like people came to me because I was on GitHub. They came like, "Oh, let me add this open source library
Mhm.
so we can do this." And I always said, "Nah, let's just build it ourselves. Like, how hard can it be?" Um, and then more people joined, and everybody was encouraged to do everything themselves, and it just went down the rabbit hole of building all kinds of things ourselves.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so that's how we ended up with like a complete cryptography library that has like all the different algorithms and key exchange and elliptic curves and stuff, and graphics libraries, photo editing, stuff like that.
Mhm. You know,
It's a lot of fun.
this kind of reminds me of a this kind of reminds me of the Linus Linux email. I'm doing a free operating system, just a hobby. Won't be big and professional like GNU.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was a bit like that, I guess. Looking back, it was very humble. Um, Although I think there were some constraints on Serenity OS that Linus didn't have, and
Mhm,
so for better or worse, like Serenity hasn't evolved in the same way that Linux did,
mhm,
because I guess because of this whole like let's build everything ourselves.
mhm.
Linux ended up like leaning heavily on other things, as Richard likes to point out.
Right.
Rich,
Yeah. Yeah. Very. Yeah. Well, it's kind of funny that you have the idea was like, oh, being professional like GNU, but nowadays GNU basically doesn't exist without Linux. The relationship there's kind of flipped.
yeah, very much, very much. But of course, Stallman was more right in the past.
Mhm,
Um, GNU was the big thing. Um, and yeah, we didn't sort of connect with any existing projects. We just
mhm,
did
mhm,
everything ourselves. And so um, we were a bit of a strange in the open source world because yes, everything is open source, but we're not actually interacting with the ecosystem at all. Like
mm,
other than using open source compiler
right.
like GCC or Clang, but we just built everything ourselves. And so um, yeah, that was a bit unusual.
Yeah. If you
Um,
decided to build the compiler yourself, I feel like that would have been where you stopped, and you wouldn't have ever got to the operating system part.
it's possible, yeah. We did start building a compiler at one point for a new language, not for
Aha.
C++. Um, but I don't work on Serenity OS anymore, so I've sort of left the project in the
Mhm,
hands of the remaining maintainers,
mhm,
because when we forked Ladybird, I realized that I'm just spending all my time working on the browser,
mhm,
and it's not right for me to sit here and say what Serenity OS should do when there's a community of people who love working on it,
mhm.
and they have all kinds of ideas that they want to do with it, and I don't want to interfere with
Right.
those ideas too much, I guess. Um, but it's been good, I think. Now everybody gets to focus on the things that they want to do, and I check in with the project every now and then. They're still working on stuff, so that's cool. Um, I hope everybody's happy after the split, even though it was a little bit. It's always difficult to divorce, um,
Mhm.
whether in software or in anything else. But I think it worked out. And I completely forgot what your question was.
No, no, we'll just that's a good question. Uh,
Something about like
I
what
think we
is
we started
Serenity?
on building from everything from scratch. That's where we started from, and we somehow got
Right.
here.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Why build from scratch? Right, right, right. Yeah. So it was just for fun,
Mhm,
just to keep myself busy. And then people wanted to join because they saw how much fun I was having, and I said, "Okay, you can join,
mhm,
but you got to build everything from scratch. No taking other libraries."
mhm,
Um, and it became like our niche, I guess.
mhm.
And people heard about our project. They're like, "Wait, there's a project where they're building everything from scratch, and I can come there and build anything from scratch." And so people joined to build like things that they were just curious about how one would build.
Mm, mm.
Um, you know, like sound editing software or like music production stuff, or
Right.
a lot of games like desktop games, things like that.
Mhm,
Um, and yeah, it became like a playground almost for hackers, I think.
mhm, mhm.
And so uh, it was just far away from what Linux became. Linux wanted to just be, I guess, like a cheap alternative to Unix, because Linus felt at the time that, hey, these Unix workstations at school are great, but I can't afford to get one at home.
Right. He said in the Linux 1.0 announcement, it was cheaper to build a Unix kernel than it was to buy a Unix license.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So quite different motivations
Mhm.
between the two projects, but initially very scrappy, both of them.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, also Serenity OS, if you haven't seen it before,
Mhm.
it famously has a very year 2000 um, Microsoft look.
Mm.
Um, the look and feel of the system is extremely inspired by Windows 2000 thereabouts,
Yes.
and
Okay. Yeah. I'd seen it before, but I couldn't picture it. But no, that's exactly what I would call it.
yeah, and that was also like I just grew up around using computers around that time. It
Mhm.
was a formative experience for me, and I just decided, hey, it's going to look like that.
Mhm. Mm.
Um, and um, looking at what Windows has become today, I don't know if you use it, but
I haven't used Windows in 5 years. Last time I touched
okay,
it was Windows 10, though.
okay. Well, so Windows, I'm sure you're aware, famously has a hard time staying consistent with UI.
Yeah, that's one way to put it.
Um,
Yeah.
and I'm 99% sure that you can probably find at least one application on a modern Windows install that still looks like it's year 2000. Um, and, one for every year since then.
Well, it took them
And
three major releases
yeah,
to replace the control panel, right? Like just
right.
just that.
Yeah. So one of the things with Serenity OS was that um, I also wanted everything to look consistent. So for that reason, we didn't port things like GTK or Qt originally at all, and just said like, hey, if you want to build a graphical app, just build it in our toolkit so that it will fit in.
Mm-hmm.
And it just created this like little world that you can go into and disappear for months if you are a programmer who enjoys these kind of things.
Hmm.
It turns out a lot of people are, and we had a lot of fun with that.
Hmm.
And that was sort of the weird cradle where Ladybird was born in
Mm.
this very, very hacker-ish environment where everybody just builds everything themselves. And it was actually one of the early frictions that we met when forking Ladybird was that people were very suspicious of not doing everything ourselves.
Mm.
Um, some folks were like, "But we made our own cryptography. Like, why do you want to use this like ready-made one? Like, what's fun with that?"
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
And things like that. And we had to sort of overcome and convince people that no, it's going to be good. Like we're going to have fast HTTPS connections. Like you won't have to wait 20 seconds to load Discord.
Right, right.
Um, and I think like once people saw the actual performance difference, then they realized, oh, well, maybe these libraries are really optimized actually.
Yeah.
um, but yeah, it was initially a bit of a bump
Mhm.
to overcome.
Mhm. Well, I want to get into the funding and sustainable development stuff, but just one side tangent. What are you having to use as a desktop right now?
Oh, right now, so
Yeah.
I have one machine with Mac OS and I
Mhm.
have one with Ubuntu.
Okay.
Um, so those are the two operating systems that we are targeting our first alpha release of
Mhm.
Ladybird for. So those are the ones I keep here.
Mhm.
And a lot of people are asking us about Windows.
I'm sure.
Some people send quite angry messages about Windows.
It's
Um,
like, oh, if you're not on Windows, you're never gonna get any support. Oh, how can this project be a browser if it's not on Windows?
yes. Have you been writing these?
Don't worry, I've got plenty of similar angry comments on various things that I'm involved in.
Right. Yeah. So you're familiar with the general sentiment.
Oh, quite
Um,
yes.
yeah. So the reality of our situation with funding is that we have 7 people that we can pay to work on this at the moment,
Mhm.
which is incredible for something that isn't even in alpha yet.
Mhm.
We're very, very happy to be able to do that, but we just don't have the manpower to target one more platform.
Mhm.
And we feel that putting out an alpha in 2026, we just have to focus on making the web work. Um, and we're starting with the platforms that we know best ourselves, and then we're just building everything in such a way that um, if you can port it to one platform, then it's not terribly complicated to port it to others.
Right.
And that said, there is a community effort to work on Windows support, which is ongoing. It's just not something that we are devoting full-time engineering to at the
Mhm,
moment.
mhm.
But they have been making progress on building. I know the JavaScript engine already works on Windows, and people are working on other parts of the browser. So when we eventually do make a commitment to Windows, we won't be starting from
Mhm.
like zero. There's there's already some work happening.
So the idea is sort of you want to get something done on a platform you know rather than trying to tackle everything at once.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Because putting out a super disappointing product on 3 platforms
Right.
versus putting out something that kind of works on 2 platforms, we're going to go with the latter. Um, and really, we would probably scale back to a single platform if we believed that we could do a better job. But
Mhm,
it turns out that macOS and Linux are sort of similar enough that it's not terribly difficult to do both.
mhm, mhm.
But Windows is just it's a bit of a stretch to say that Windows is similar to the Unix
Right.
systems.
Right.
Yeah.
That's fair. Um Yeah, I think I think people kind of forget that sometimes that macOS is just Unix. It doesn't look like what you expect from Unix because it's fancy Apple graphical environment, but at the core, it's just a Unix kernel. Like there's not. It's maybe they like don't want you to. They want most of their customers to ever think about that. They just want them to look at the fancy graphics. But yeah, it's not like obviously Windows is a very different platform, right? Like there's just a whole different development philosophy that went into it. Yeah, I get why you've gone this route, and I would much rather prefer you to stick with something that I how would I say it? First impression is very important, right? And you want to make
Mhm.
sure that what people see when you've not called it ready, but when you've called it, hey, this is our alpha. Yes, people are going to know it's an alpha, but look, people judge things how they see it. It doesn't matter if it's an alpha, it doesn't matter if it's a beta. It's the tagged release. It's out there. So this is how people are going to judge it. I've talked a lot with the guys doing the Cosmic Desktop, and it's the same idea where they are very particular about when they want this thing to be ready, and they waited a very long time before even starting the alpha. Basically, it was mostly complete when the alpha started, because
Mm.
if it was any earlier, if it crashed all the time, anything like that, that idea sort of it stays with a project even after those problems are resolved. Like Pulse Audio obviously has that stuck to it. System D has that stuck to it. Even though a lot of those early issues haven't been KDE, right? KDE 4 was a horrible release, and people still have that idea in their head because that's what it was like, so that's what it's always going to be like.
Yeah, very true. You only get one chance to make a first impression,
Mhm,
is what I'm always telling people. And we have to make an actual effort to make that first impression a decent one.
mhm,
And this is why we don't provide like easily accessible nightly builds right now,
mhm.
for example,
Is that a
because we
plan during
don't
the
want.
alpha?
Yeah. During the alpha, we're gonna make it available.
Mhm,
Yes, but right now, um, basically, a person who wants to try Ladybird but is unable to run the 2 or 3 shell commands required to build it themselves are 100% going to be disappointed
right.
by the product in the current state.
Mhm,
And so we put up this tiny little roadblock of saying you have to build it yourself. Here are the
mhm,
commands, very very straightforward, just to avoid giving people like a bad experience for no reason,
mhm.
basically.
Yeah.
And also, what we're looking for at the moment is really not users, but developers and sponsors. And so our messaging is geared towards that at the moment.
Mhm.
But that will obviously change um, as we put out an actual alpha version and start soliciting bug reports and um, whatever information we can gather from people without telemetry, obviously, or with some extremely opt-in form of telemetry.
Mhm.
I know that's an extremely sensitive topic, and
I've made my
yeah,
opinion very clear on that. My opinion, like in case you aren't aware, my opinion is if you opt into it, if you're informed, I literally don't care. Like, take a sample of my DNA. If you tell me exactly what you're taking, that's fine. I've agreed. This is the contract that I have agreed to. That's fine. But when it's opt out, it gets very. I am
yeah,
very opposed to it. I understand the developer perspective and why people want it, because if you have opt-in, you're going to be selecting for people who are more likely to be in certain groups, like maybe the more technical users who are going to be on certain kinds of systems, so you may not get a good representative sample. I understand why. I just don't like it.
yeah, yeah. It's true, but you have to make a compromise there, I think,
Mm.
and given what we can see in the browser industry with, let's say, major players shooting themselves in the foot repeatedly
Mm-hmm.
in various ways, we should, at the very least, try to learn from their mistakes and not repeat them. Um, let's at least find new mistakes to make. Um,
I
I
think one
think.
thing with opt-out is if it's opt-out from the start, people go into it knowing what to expect. It's when you change the deal along, like, halfway through, right?
Yeah, very true. Yeah. Yeah. So we are gonna come into this with a everything is opt-in from the start,
Mhm.
and we want to keep it that way. And it's just easier for us to um, be like sort of purist, I
Mm.
guess, about being opt-in if we just commit to that from the very beginning, because then it's obvious what we shouldn't do, that we shouldn't add any kind of telemetry that would be opt-out. Um, and yeah, some people are going to want to opt in, and bless them for doing that. We will probably figure out a way to collect primarily crash data, I guess,
Sure.
is what's going to be interesting. We certainly don't care about who's using the browser or what they're using it for. It's more about like how does it crash,
Right, right, right.
or unexpected situations occurring in the field that we had not predicted, that
Mhm.
kind of thing. Um, and yeah, it's unclear to me what is the absolute best way of doing this, because I think you can't ever please everybody.
Sure.
There are some extremely hardcore privacy people who, like you could say, for example, we offer an opt-in telemetry,
Mhm.
or you can say, well, we have two binaries, one with opt-in telemetry, one with it
Right.
compiled out, and that's still not good enough for some people. They demand that it shouldn't even be in the source code,
Mhm.
and so on. And finding, I think we'll find like a reasonable point there where we can make most people trust what we're doing.
Mhm.
And obviously, everything is open source and inspectable and so on.
Yeah, I don't think there's any value in trying to appease the people who don't want it in the code base, right? Like, that's just you're trying at that point, you're kind of on this infinite purity test. It's like, okay, well, if
Yeah.
I'm going to remove that, well, how can you trust the third party libraries? Then you kind of go back to that. Okay, we have to write all of that in house. And okay, well, you just keep going. You just keep finding more and more things. Like, there has to be a cutoff point, and I think that cutoff point, is if maybe if you really wanted to have it be a compile toggle, right? Like, I don't think that's that big of a deal. But even if it's just like you can turn it off in the menu, like, that's fine. I know some people would want that extra sort of security. Not even just security, just some people just don't like to compile in things they're not going to use, right? So if it's
Yeah.
behind a compile flag, right, that, yeah. I think that's the as far as I think would be sensible to go.
Yeah, completely agree. I think pushing past that point, then it starts to get a little bit silly.
Mhm.
Um, and you're getting into this territory with a bunch of people that you will never really please them anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You will never reason with the unreasonable.
Right. Yeah. And we're already learning, we don't even have a downloadable binary, but we're already meeting some people who are a little bit unreasonable with
Mhm.
feature demands
Mhm.
that they send me. Um, but for most people, it's going to be very reasonable software, we
Mhm.
hope.
Well, let's talk funding because funding a project like a browser is a challenge, right? Because you're either a company like Google where the browser is a thing you do, but it's not your primary business. Google, if they got rid of Chrome, they have everything else they do. They have the search engine, they have YouTube, they have Gmail, everything else. And then you have, obviously, Mozilla, where they started off with a donation based model and now they're basically a Google sub brand. And then you have models like Brave, for example, where Brave has. They have, like support contracts and they also have their crypto model as well. And then you have other companies like Opera does their stuff. And like how do you make a browser that is actually fundable? Like how do you fund a browser? And obviously you're still fairly early on, so maybe look, maybe in the long run this doesn't work, but at least the approach that's being taken now.
Right. So what we're doing right now is that we are just taking sponsorships
Mhm.
and donations.
Mhm.
So sponsorships are some company or an individual decides that they want to donate some amount towards our development because they like what we're doing for one reason or another.
Mhm.
And so they give us the money. We put their logo on our website. We say thank you,
Mhm.
and then there are no strings attached beyond that point.
Mhm.
So we don't have any kind of monetization plans. In fact, the official line is no monetization of our users ever. And I know that perhaps in the last week or so, people have been betrayed on the concept of never ever will we do this.
Mhm.
But I don't think we should become cynical just because a big corporation goes back on a promise.
Mhm.
We don't want to monetize our users um, because we are ourselves users that don't want to be monetized. And by monetize in this case, what we mean specifically is that we don't want to sort of turn our users into a product for somebody else to buy, right?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
It doesn't mean that I wouldn't that we wouldn't try to sell a coffee cup or a T-shirt someday to a willing buyer, but we're not selling out our users, I suppose.
Mhm.
And so we just seek sponsorships and donations from companies and users who want this to exist, who think that this is a good idea.
Mhm.
And we know, of course, that this will never raise $1 billion like selling default search placement would.
Mhm.
And we have made peace with that. And that is sort of why we have a very small team with a small budget
Mhm.
and we're trying to engineer something that a small team with a small budget can maintain in perpetuity. Um, Simply because we know from the get-go that we're not going to we're not going to find some way to sell our users. So, our users is our only real asset that we have that we could sell, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Because we're a permissively licensed open source project. Anybody can take it and build a better browser
What
if they
license
have
does
some
it use,
idea.
by the way?
Oh, it's a two-clause BSD.
Okay.
So, and people ask about that too sometimes, and they say, "Well, what if Google just takes your code and makes a better product?" Then I would just say, "Good on them for making a better product." We'll do our best to compete with their better product, but at the end of the day, that's the setup.
Mhm.
It's a permissively licensed project, and we are committing 100% to not selling out our users to anybody and instead funding it with sponsorships and voluntary donations.
Mhm.
And so far, there has been it's been really quite nice and easy to raise money. People are really hyped on the idea,
Mhm, mhm,
and a lot of companies are getting behind the idea. I think everybody has their own motivations, but when I speak to our corporate sponsors, there is a common theme of feeling perhaps a little bit concerned that there's very centralized control over the web platform.
mhm, mhm,
So you have all these companies building on top of the web platform, and they are all at the mercy of Google, essentially deciding what happens with the web platform. And so, if your entire business sits on top of the web platform, it's in your interest that that platform be um, remain open, let's say, and remain vibrant and remain something that can actually be implemented anew if the existing players stop caring about it or do something objectionable, let's say.
mhm,
So that's kind of where we're at. So we're just talking to companies, new companies all the time, and um, just finding a lot of excitement about the idea.
mhm.
And a lot of the reactions that I get when I meet with people is that like, "Oh, well, we didn't even realize that would be possible." Like, you you can build a new browser? We thought we were kinda stuck with the situation that we had, right?
Mm, mm,
Um, so people are enthusiastic, and of course, there's been a lot of skepticism about the feasibility of it. But I find that over time, as we've been doing this, we've been kind of melting hearts around the industry, like people seeing our progress, and um, slowly they start to admit that, okay, well, maybe it is possible to build one of these things.
mm.
That's been lovely to see as well.
For anyone
Uh,
just listening, when you mentioned corporate sponsors, platinum tier right now is Futo and Shopify. Platinum is that 100K or above?
that's right.
Yes. Okay. Um, Gold is Proton VPN. Um, I don't know who the AHR yet. I've never heard of that company. I don't know what they do. What do
It's
they do?
RFs. They are an SEO and
Oh.
web
I
tech
see,
company.
I see, I see. And there's a bunch of other like silver sponsors and bronze. Actually, wait, is that Mitchell Hashimoto? Is that the ghosty guy?
The one and only, yes.
Yeah, okay. I thought the name sounded familiar. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I just want to bring that up just so people are sort of aware of just there are like companies involved in this, or like, companies who sponsored this who you're aware of. It's not just it's not just individual donors, right? Like there are companies that have put their support behind this project and I guess are at least trying to make something happen here.
Right, exactly. And I should also mention that my co-founder for the nonprofit, Chris Wanstroth,
Mm,
he seeded our corporation with $1 million as
mm,
well to get us off the ground, and then
mm,
we've been raising from other companies on top of that.
mm, mm,
And it's not raising venture capital in the traditional way that people do it.
mm,
We're actually just um, raising sponsorships.
mm, mm.
So the only thing we're selling here is the logo on our website, and we will say thank you on x.com and in our newsletter and video and such. Um, and yeah, this it's just it's, perhaps a lot of it is that we're just in the right place at the right time, doing
Mhm,
something that a lot of people were not expecting to happen, and when they hear about it, they just instantly get excited about it.
mhm. So with funding this project, how much leeway do you try to keep to make sure, you don't have to just suddenly get rid of people?
Right. So we've committed to maintaining 18 months
Mhm,
of runway, which means that if people just stop sponsoring us tomorrow, nobody renews their sponsorships, all recurring donations stop. Um, let's say we can go for 18 months
mhm,
with our current burn rate of expenses and salaries and such.
mhm,
And so we're going to try to maintain that, which means that we don't add people to our team unless we can afford to.
right.
Um, and I think that's just a reasonable way to do this because we could certainly build faster if we decided let's just go for it. Like
Right,
let's
you take the
hire.
the Silicon Valley approach and burn all your money and then hope
Yeah,
someone acquires you.
exactly. And we're not doing that. Um, and I think it creates a better environment for everybody. And sure, it slows us down a little bit, but as I keep saying, like this is about finding a sustainable way of doing this,
Mhm,
right? It's not about building a browser as fast as possible. It is about building something that a small team can maintain forever.
mhm,
Um, and I guess it's never really been done before because all the teams that really build browsers have been traditionally super well funded.
mhm,
They have some kind of backing in the billions. And yeah, so this is just something that we have to do. We have to stay very, very calm and composed with expenses.
mhm, mhm,
Um, but it's not just about the money, it's also about architectural decisions and choices when we work on the software.
mhm, mhm.
Um, like not taking on, for example, complexity that um, would be inordinately difficult to maintain.
Mhm.
So we, I guess, a practical example of that is if something is unimportant, maybe we don't put a bunch of effort into optimizing it.
Mm.
Um, and the obvious example is JavaScript execution. So in the major browsers, you have hundreds of man years and PhDs poured into JavaScript performance.
Right.
Because I think around 2009 or 2008, something like that, they decided to have a performance war between the major browsers because they put out these JavaScript benchmarks, and then it was just on for a decade where they just kept building more and more complicated just-in-time compilers to beat each other on these benchmarks.
Mhm.
And it's like incredible feats of engineering have taken place here, but looking at this from our perspective, where we're just coming into this, the idea of like burning a million lines of code on a optimizing JavaScript compiler, um, when JavaScript right now is around 3% of our execution time, it doesn't feel like the most important thing to do.
Right.
Um, and it's certainly possible, or it is certainly the case that there are websites that rely on fast JavaScript, but
Mhm.
the vast majority of the web, it's kind of not relevant. And so, at least at the moment, we have to choose um, to optimize for most of the web
Mhm.
and to
Mhm.
optimize for sort of simplicity, if you will, maintainability in our architecture.
Mhm.
And then, that sort of idea spread throughout the entire project where we just don't overcomplicate things in the interest of keeping it maintainable.
Mhm. So to keep the team small, you have to design things to make it so it's actually maintainable by a small team, effectively.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I don't know exactly where the threshold is, but I've learned from experience working on much larger teams that at a certain point, you become this kind of project where people silo themselves,
Mm.
where you no longer have a person working on the project, but they're working on a subsystem in the project.
Right.
Um, and to some extent, like everybody becomes experts on subsystems that they're focusing on, but
Mhm.
I would like our project to have a lot of people that are just comfortable going all over the place. And the only way that that's really achievable is if the thing is small or small enough that you can do that.
Right.
In a 10 million line code base like WebKit, nobody's an expert on the whole thing. Probably nobody's even truly proficient in the whole thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so that's something that we're trying to design for as well, to have a code base. When I say that it's maintainable by a small team, I really, I guess I mean exactly that, that it is maintainable by a small team that can operate across the code base um, productively.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think a really good example of a project that ends up siloing, kind of because it just has to, is going back to the Linux kernel, where you can see the list of the silos because they have a big maintainer list of each thing that people are a maintainer on. And those people, maybe they get involved in some other little things here and there, but a lot of the time they are, I am the DRM person. I am doing memory management. I'm doing this driver. I'm doing that driver. And the Linux kernel really isn't a project. It's basically a mono repo of a bunch of smaller projects. And people kind of just do their own thing. The only time they really interact with each other is when there is some sort of crossover, like you have, the Rust discussions, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, obviously, if a new person joins our project, they are going to be limited to a small area at first. But we don't put up any of these sort of fences or boundaries between subsystems.
Mhm.
Everybody's welcome to work on any part of it. Their rules are the same. Like there is no like, oh, if you want to touch this, you have to talk to that guy, and if you want to touch that. Um, and I understand in a project like Linux that they need to have this level of coordination because there are so many people working on it with completely different incentives and reasons for doing what they're doing.
Mhm.
So it's just necessary, and we want to not be that
Sure.
ever, basically.
Mhm.
We'd be happy to have their success of distribution, but not so much the bureaucracy around
Mhm.
it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense because you get to a point where if things get too big, you end up having people that need to manage the people that are managing the people, and that level of bureaucracy is the thing that slows down a lot of big projects. Like you see this in like modern game development where you have these, 1,000 people working on a game. The credits are 40 minutes long, and the game costs $200 million to make. But you look at the credits and half the people on there aren't even like actually working on the game. They're just managing the managers so that they can like coordinate across all of their different teams.
Yeah, indeed. That whole industry is it's amazing to me.
Mhm.
Um, how they manage to build these things. It's very impressive. A
Mhm.
little bit lifeless, perhaps, but that's an entirely different discussion.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, yeah.
So, what is I guess we can go into like what is like the long term vision for the project? Like where, say, we get past full release, say we're like 5, 10 years from now, like where do you want the browser to be? Like in a perfect world where everything where timelines are met, where things actually happen when you expect them to, where do you want to be?
So ultimately, what we want to do is we want to give people another alternative,
Mhm.
something that they can choose. And we would be very happy if we can put out a product
Mhm.
that some people choose and they love it
Mhm.
because it aligns perfectly with their own interests and their own idea of what a web browser should be.
Mhm.
Um, Now, what does that look like in practice? 5 to 10 years from now, well, we want to be on all the major platforms that people are actually using.
Mhm.
So Mac OS, Linux, and Windows are the obvious desktop platforms. We
Mhm.
want to try to be on the main mobile platforms as well, if they are still Android and iOS. We'll see. And we want to be something that anybody could download and start using, and it would be no fuss, just a browser. Um, doesn't try to do anything fancy, but supports the basic browsing needs of the average person
Mhm.
and allows you to use the popular extensions that people like to use.
Mhm.
That's sort of our goal. Like, when you go to a hardware store and you pick up a hammer and
Mhm.
you don't care what brand it is, if we can manage to build a browser that feels like that, like, oh, this works perfectly for me.
Mhm.
I forgot what it was called, but I remember the icon. I just tap on it and I'm online. Um, it's kind of modest as in terms of ambition, but
Mhm.
I would really like to build something like that just works for people. That just is just a competent browser,
Mhm.
um, and something that we also managed to prove is maintainable by a small team with a small budget. In a way, I'm almost like afraid that somebody would decide to throw a large amount of money at us,
Mhm.
um, because it would put us in an awkward position of having these resources that we're we're trying to um, build something to handle without. Um, but that's a very bizarre, luxurious problem statement, I suppose. Like, I sure hope nobody gives us a
I have
lot of
too
money.
much money to deal. What do I do with all this money?
Yeah, yeah.
No, I
But
think
like,
that's
if you
a.
if you look,
Oh,
yeah.
go on.
I was just gonna say, like, you can see if you look at some of the major browsers today, how things can go terribly wrong if you get comfortable with that big pile of money.
Mhm.
When suddenly the people that were kept refilling it, they just stopped doing that
Mhm.
for one reason or another, or the money stops flowing.
Mhm.
And so we don't want to get ourselves into a position where that could become a problem. So if we really like the setup that we have right now, where we have many sponsors, each contributing
Mhm.
like a portion of the sponsorship,
Mhm.
and we would like to expand that so we have like a strong patchwork network of sponsors, um, to give us that diversity of sponsors, I guess.
Mhm.
Um,
I think having that vision as a simple browser is kind of something that needs to be out there, right? Because with all of these browsers, which are basically just, all Chromium skins or all Firefox skins, because everybody is building off of the same engines, the way they're differentiating themselves is adding more and more stuff into the browser, right? Like, let's even use like Vivaldi as an example, where they have an email client, an RSS feed reader, and a bunch, like every browser now has a PDF reader inside of it, and it's just adding more and more and more things into the browser. I don't think there's anything wrong with doing that, right? If that's what you want from it, you want this mega application where realistically you don't need, like, you could use your browser as an RSS feed reader. You could use it as a PDF reader. You don't need these tools installed on your system. But at the same time, a browser doesn't need to do all of that. You can have a browser that's its job is to be a browser, and I think there's definitely a place for that, and especially when it comes to actually creating something which can be maintained, I think sort of just has to be how you do it.
I imagine so, yeah, and like we're very like, unlike all of these companies that are building on top of Chromium or WebKit or
Mm,
whatever, we are very sort of grounded in our and the technical reality of what we're doing, right?
mhm,
Like,
mhm,
we're in the middle of building the engine, and we're very aware of what goes into that. And so our ambitions right now are just to build a competent engine, and then wrap that in a simple browser. And who knows, maybe when we get this thing working really well, we will have users saying like, it's really frustrating that whenever I download a PDF, it pops open in another window. Maybe we figure out a way to optionally integrate a PDF.js or some viewer like that,
sure.
whatever. But for the time being, like, just a very simple browser is sort of where we're aiming for. That said, I think it's important to establish already now that we mean a simple browser with privacy respecting defaults,
Mhm,
um, and sensible privacy oriented defaults, let's say. And I don't like looking at ads online any more than you do. I don't like being tracked online any more than you do either.
mhm,
And we absolutely want to have all of the faculties necessary for like blocking ads, blocking tracking, all of that stuff.
mhm.
We're not trying to build a browser that like gives the trackers what they want.
Sure.
It's ultimately we're building this product for users.
Mhm,
Um, so yeah, I guess that's the one thing I would add to it. It's a simple generic browser for users,
mhm,
not for anybody else.
mhm.
And we are in a good position to build that because we don't have any loyalties to, um, you know, advertisers or trackers or whoever would want to find out more about what you're doing online.
Mhm.
Um, And yeah, in some ways, I guess we are in the best position of all the browsers to build something like that.
So earlier you talked about how at one point what was driving development is some would say, hey, this site doesn't work, and you would sort of try to get that site working. And you said you switched to more of a test-driven development. So how is the project actually driven now? Like, how do you decide that this is the thing we need to work on?
So it's a hybrid approach, let's
Mhm,
say. We have 7 people working on it full time, and then we
mhm,
also have a community of volunteers working on it as well.
mhm,
And everybody has sort of specialized in an approach to development, let's say.
mhm,
So we have some of the test driven people, some of the performance driven people, and also some sort of compatibility driven people. Um, and as a leader and manager, what I try to do is I try to find what type of person somebody is, how do
mhm,
they thrive as a developer, and then just get them to work in that way. So
mhm,
if somebody thrives pushing um, test scores go up, then
mhm,
like try to find a way for them to work where that can be central to their work.
mhm,
If
mhm,
somebody gets really excited about seeing websites work, try to find a way for them to work where they can get to see websites work.
mm,
And we have all different types of person on the team,
mhm,
and what that gives us is like a nice coverage, I suppose, where we're making progress on all these fronts at the same time. Um, but the test driven part is a little bit newish. So in August of last year, so I guess like half a year ago, 6 months ago, if my math is mathing, um, it's difficult to do arithmetic sometimes.
I get it. I get it.
At least when you're on a podcast. But yes, half a year ago, we
Mhm,
started running this thing called the web platform tests,
mm,
which is a comprehensive test suite for browsers. It's co-maintained by all the browser vendors.
mhm,
So the idea is that whenever somebody implements a feature or fixes a bug in a browser,
mhm,
you would create a bunch of tests to go along with that, and then contribute those to the web platform tests repository. And in this repository today, there are, I think, like 2 million subtests, which is just
uh-huh.
large amount of tests, let's
Right.
say.
Yeah.
And
Like that's putting
yeah,
I think that's like no, that's a lot more than like Vulkan has, and Vulkan already has a stupid amount of tests.
right. Yeah. So the web platform is fairly complicated.
Mhm.
Um, I think that's fair to say.
I think
And
so.
a lot of tests have been written for it. And the test suite is by no means like a complete coverage of the platform. It's
Mhm,
evolving daily. People keep adding more tests to it. And this is a great thing because it means that every browser can run these tests and find out, do we behave the same as the other browsers? Are
mhm,
we implementing the spec correctly? And once we became able to run this test suite, it just became a part of our workflow is to um, see how we're doing and
mhm.
try to make improvements on our test score, because the more of these tests we pass, the more coverage of the web platform we have in our browser and the more compatible we are with other browsers.
How long does it take to run through this test suite?
At the moment, it takes us just under 5 hours. Um, but we are also working on improving the cycle times.
Mhm,
So what the other browsers tend to do is they throw multiple machines at this. So they just like
right.
divide a run across many machines. We do it on a single machine. And so the other browsers, they kind of finish a run in an hour or so.
Mhm.
And then we're taking 5 times as much time.
Right,
Um,
right. I
yeah.
guess there would be sets of tests that are logical to group together, so you could put those all on one machine.
Yeah, I think in theory you can kind of slice and dice however you like and
Okay,
just
fair enough.
divide it across many machines.
Mhm,
But that's not something we've done yet because it's been good enough for us to get a new score every 5 hours. It's been okay.
sure.
Um, but yeah, it takes us about 5 hours to run, and our current score is something like 1.77 million points out of 2 million.
Okay.
So we've been making good progress, and if you look closely at this, you'll find that it's like very heavily weighted in some categories. There
Mm.
is famously 1.1 million tests for Chinese, Japanese, and Korean text encoding.
Ah,
Um, so
ah,
I like to make graphs that subtract those tests because um, it's a bit more interesting without them.
right,
Since
yeah.
everybody supports those things, and then you get 1.1 million points for free. Yeah.
Yeah, just for anyone who's unaware of some of the problems here, like these are very complex. Firstly, if they're very complex characters, then you have the issue of right to left writing or up down
Mhm.
writing. Then you have issues with like handling your the different character sets as well. So with Japanese, you don't just have the kanji, you have hiragana and katakana, so you have to deal with that as well. And then there are different there are this is some that some people don't realize. There's different width versions of them as well. There's the full width and the half width, which are used for different things, and that's just like scratching the surface of just things that I'm coming up with off the top of my head. I'm sure in Korean they have a bunch of other weird similar things as well. I would imagine that there's probably some weird things with like dealing with Arabic as well, because you're again right to left, and the the characters are the way they're rendered depends on the specific way they're written. Like characters will change depending on how a word is written as well, which I'm sure also creates other oddities.
Sure, yeah. So we don't support all of these things
Mm-mm.
correctly, but certainly a lot more than we used to because we used to make our own font rendering library for
Yeah.
SerenityOS.
This
Um,
feels a lot like making your own time zone library.
yes, which we did. Um, and yeah, so we've since adopted Skia for graphics and Harfbuzz for text shaping, which is used, like all over the open source world.
Right.
And that gives us like way better support for things like right to left or as you say, these letters that change shape depending on the context
Mhm.
using complex shaping rules and stuff. And so that stuff is improving. um, we also use the ICU library from the Unicode consortium, which gives us like a lot of interesting things like I guess gives you access to like the million little pieces of metadata about different writing systems
Mhm,
that you
mhm.
might need, um, like how to distinguish I know you can interleave like left to right and right to left text in the same paragraph and things
Mhm,
like that.
mhm.
And I don't think we're doing everything correctly with those things, but we're
Frankly,
leaning more and
no
more on
one's
ICU.
doing everything correctly. Like you,
Probably not. Yeah.
if if you just want a great example, just there are people that will set their usernames on YouTube to these just weird sets of Unicode characters, and you end up seeing the name spread across the entire screen because nothing handles it correctly.
Yeah, that's definitely a thing. And we are no better with these things. But yeah, it's a big part of the web platform tests is Chinese, Japanese, Korean. So when we say 1.77 million,
Mhm.
just you can kind of subtract 1.1 million from everybody's score, and then it's easier to compare them to each
Right.
other. Um, and if you want to put that into context, the landscape currently, you have three major engines, which
Mhm.
is Chromium, Firefox, and Safari WebKit, right? And then some people say Edge, but Edge is just Chromium. So you have those three major engines, and they are at the top on the web platform test scores. And then out of the sort of up and coming underdog engines, we are leading that pack.
Mhm.
Um, but we are, I don't know, maybe like 200,000 tests behind the first major engine that we want to catch up to.
Okay.
Um, or I should get you a current number. No, we are 153,000 tests behind Safari.
Okay.
So it's going to take a lot of effort to catch up.
Mhm.
The points are not as easy to come by these days as they used to be.
Right. Right. You've
Um,
a lot of the low hanging fruit's gone.
Yes, they are gone, and we have squeezed them for all their juice. And so now it's like the slow grind of fixing little things again and again, over and over until we catch up. But it's what we've signed up for,
Mhm,
and it is a beautifully, um, let's say, distributable task that maps really well to a community, which is something that we're very fortunate to have for Ladybird,
mhm,
because it's not just our us full timers working on it. It's
mhm,
also like just enthusiasts around the world, people with jobs or people in university who find this interesting and they want to hack on it.
mhm,
And it's very, very easy to motivate somebody with a test score.
mhm, mhm,
Can just say like, "Hey, I can spend my evening getting this test score to go up a little bit."
mhm, mhm.
It's just really fun. I love doing it as well, and um, it's I don't know. I have faith that we're going to be able to keep pushing it upwards for the foreseeable future.
Mhm.
Um, but the points are getting harder to come by, and we're going to have to do hard work, like more complicated things for some of the points. But it is what it is.
I'm looking at
Yeah.
the list of contributors, and I'm surprised how many like how many people like a lot of projects. It's obviously you're at the top, and then there's like a massive drop off to the next person. But there's a lot of people with hundreds of contributions here.
Right. So if you're looking at our GitHub, it's important to know that we forked from SerenityOS.
Sure.
So if you're looking at total contributions, that includes the backlog of commits
Mm-mm-mm.
all over SerenityOS as well, not
Right, right,
specific
right,
to a
right.
browser. But if you look just in the last year, you will
Hmm.
see specifically Ladybird stuff.
Hmm.
But yeah, like we have a lot of people making a lot of contributions, um, a lot of very active people.
Hmm.
And in the beginning, I don't remember exactly when it happened, but I used to have this metric of like how many percent of the code base was I the last person to touch.
Mm.
And in the beginning, it was 100%. Like I was still the only person working on it. And then over time, that number kept going down. And at some point, it crossed the 50% threshold, and it felt like pretty wholesome thing. Like, okay,
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm no longer the majority of code touchers here.
Hmm.
Um, and nowadays, I'm just a fraction of the activity, like everybody else,
Hmm.
which is a beautiful thing, I think.
I think it's the sign of a really healthy project, right? Like every project's going to have some major person. Like even if it's a relatively healthy project, there's going to be people that are the most active, whether it be the Linux kernel, whether it be a desktop. Like you're gonna have those clear major contributors. But what you want to have is people who are that active base as well. They aren't spending every waking hour of their day working the project, but people who frequently come back, and they're not just the one-off contributors. That like there's nothing wrong with that either. But having a strong base there, and a
Yeah.
strong base that's growing as well, like that's a really good thing for a project to have.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. And our base, it does like it grows over time
Mm.
for sure. Our Discord community is a good way to see this. Like it keeps growing over time,
Mm-hmm,
but
mm-hmm.
people sort of drift in and out
Sure.
as real life gets in the way. Um, but I think we're like 12,000 people on Discord or something like that now, which is just a lot of people.
Mm-hmm,
Um, and obviously, a small fraction of those people contribute to the project in the form of code, but um, every I always think that everything you say on Discord or social media is sort of an opportunity to entice a new developer to join the project
mm-hmm,
and to get excited about some aspect of it. And it's has been working for us at least so far. We're always introducing new people to development. Somebody's making their first Ladybird contribution today somewhere in the world, and that's awesome. We're happy with that.
mm-hmm. Well, speaking of bringing developers in, obviously I have to ask you about Swift, because
Mhm.
that's been like a weird thing I've heard about the project wanting to shift towards. And I have a little bit of Swift experience. I've done a little bit of iOS development in the past, but I, why? I think it's the easiest question. Why?
Right. So we want to, in the long term, we want to find a solution for the typical safety and security problems that plague browsers.
Hmm.
Um, we have a code base in C++ today because that's what SerenityOS was, because that's what I knew when I started it. Um, and so we've evolved into a large C++ project.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, it seems that C++, the language, is not willing to evolve um, safety features, at least not of the scale and scope that would be considered appropriate, let's say,
Hmm.
in this day and age.
Right.
And so we have to look for sort of a solution for the future where we can keep our current code base,
Hmm.
but incrementally um, add safety features so that we can be sure that we are building a secure piece of software, I
Hmm.
suppose. That's sort of the motivation for it. Like we're trying to think long term. We need a solution for the safety and security issue in the long term. And then we looked at the different alternatives for that. And I what we did was I asked people to try prototyping different pieces of the code base in
Hmm.
different languages. And I know a lot of people don't like to hear this, but we tried Rust, and initially people were quite excited about it because a lot of hype around the
Hmm.
language. But inevitably, every single person that I asked to prototype in it um, became frustrated in one way or another.
Hmm.
That it just kind of didn't um, either like didn't map to the kind of problems that we wanted to solve,
Hmm.
and it was cumbersome to work with, and it just it didn't feel like a good fit in our code base. And um, Swift was another language that people were initially very suspicious of.
Hmm.
Um, I even had a slightly hard time getting people to try it because they were like, "Oh, what's this Apple thing?" Um, but then when they tried it, they came back saying like, "Oh, well, this is so incredibly pleasant.
Hmm.
It fits into our code base kind of perfectly. It maps to our coding style, and it has language level support for the features that we use. It's like very object oriented. Rust is not object oriented,
Hmm.
and Swift has a lot of flaws, but um, it is object oriented. We are object oriented, and most importantly of all, they have an actively developing C++ interoperability story.
Hmm.
So the Swift team is like very actively, very consciously trying to become sort of the C++ successor language. So they are adding
Hmm.
features to their language, and they tell people, we want to be the language that you add to your C++ code base when you want to evolve into a modern language. So they allow you to interact directly with C++. Like you can call C++ functions back and forth. Now, in practice, this is not all roses.
Right.
It's not completely mature, and we have certainly run into issues with trying the C++ interop ourselves. We've reported a bunch of bugs, and we still have yet to begin sort of expansive use of Swift in our code base because of sort of remaining interoperability riddles that we haven't solved yet.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, the what it really came down to was that everybody just kind of liked it,
Hmm.
and they didn't enjoy Rust. And the Rust people are not always great at hearing this. Um, yeah, I guess I don't need to say more than that. um, Anyway, yes, we tried
Yes.
those languages. We also tried some other languages.
Hmm.
We are not interested in language war. So when people ask like, "Well, did you try my favorite language? Here's why you should use my favorite language." We just say like,
Where's
"Yeah, don't
Zig?
don't worry
Why
about it."
not
Yeah.
Zig? The Zig people are the new Rust people. I remember when I was in university. That was when Rust was like first getting attention. There was one guy I knew who was the Rust evangelist. This was before there was any Rust jobs. No one was doing professional Rust work yet, but he was the guy. He was the guy who would constantly tell me about it. I have people doing the same thing right now with Zig, and I'm sure there's going to be a future for it somewhere. But like there are some people that get very, very hung up on the language rather than what is the best tool for the job.
Yeah, exactly. That's kind of our thinking is that what is the best tool for the job? What are we really trying to achieve?
Mm,
And if I'm perfectly honest, what I would love to happen is I could just have C++ plus plus with a garbage collector for memory safety.
mhm,
Um, because then everything would just work the way that it already does. And the garbage collector would prevent us from committing memory sins. Um, but C++ plus plus doesn't come with a garbage collector. So, and neither does Swift or Rust, by the way.
mhm.
And the web platform requires a garbage collector because of JavaScript. So
Right.
it's just something that you have to provide somehow. And if I were to start over today, for the record, I would build this whole thing in a garbage collected language.
Mhm.
Um, but that's not really an option at this time.
If you had that option, what language would you go with?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Um, I would have to I would have to mess around and see what the landscape looks like.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm sure there is one. I'm afraid that I would end up with Java, but I would like to look around first. Um, yeah. No, I think in general, in my experience as a programmer professionally, for the last 20 years,
Mhm.
there's always been a language that people are extremely hyped about, and they think the whole world should be rewritten in this language. And every year, it's like an election to choose the new language for that year.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, when I was first starting out in the 90s, Java was like that language that everybody should rewrite in.
Mhm.
And at some point, like C sharp, and like it's been
I remember
trading
before
back and
Rust
forth.
was like really the hype thing, everyone was talking about Go.
Yeah, Go for a time, yeah. And, there's always, like, an energy like that, and I
Sure.
think it's a good thing that people get hyped on new technologies and new inventions,
Mhm, mhm,
but it's important to understand that these are fads, to an extent, right?
mhm.
That doesn't take away from the sort of technical achievement of new languages with
Sure.
new ideas, but there is a fad component, and there's also sort of football hooligan component to these things,
Mm.
um, and it's a little off-putting, to be honest, especially as somebody who's getting a little older, a little tired of the football hooligan aspect of language
Mhm,
evangelism, let's say. But that ultimately that doesn't really factor into our choice to use Swift.
mhm.
It was just like comfortable to use
Sure.
it.
Now, one thing you brought up that I can't let you go by, I can't let you go by without bringing it back up. Um,
Mhm.
Object oriented. People are very, very, very opinionated about um programming paradigms, and object oriented is usually the one that's very maligned.
Mhm.
Why is it an OO code base?
So the web platform
Mm-hmm.
was born in the 1990s
Mm-hmm.
when OO was like the rage, right? Um, and a lot of the central APIs and object models in a browser are object oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And because of compatibility, they just don't change. And
Right.
so fundamentally, the engine that we have to build for the web is built around objects that talk to each other in very typical object-oriented ways. And so it's just the most straightforward programming paradigm to implement a browser engine in.
Mm-hmm.
It just maps beautifully to the specs. Um, one of the things that we do, I haven't talked about that in Ladybird, is that to sort of one of the many things that we do to alleviate the maintenance burden is that we try to implement our code so that it looks exactly like the spec, or as close to the spec as possible,
I did see
down
you
to like,
complaining
yeah.
about the spec on Twitter the other day about the spec not exactly being the what is actually the actual way it's supposed to be.
Right, right. So the web specifications are supposed to match what browsers are really doing,
Mm-hmm.
and when that's not the case, sometimes the spec has to change, sometimes the browser has to change.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody gets together and they have to decide like which way is it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and at the same time, like all the other browsers, when they implement a spec, they sort of tend to freestyle a lot. Like they read the spec and they see like, okay, so this is what's supposed to happen.
Uh-huh.
I will implement this in my favorite way, that in a way that I think makes sense. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
it's for like personal taste reasons, or maybe it fits into the programming model that they have in their browser or whatever. Um, we have tried to evolve our programming model so that it can look literally like the spec as much as possible. So that if you're like reading our code out loud, it matches almost word for word what's in the spec.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's not always possible or practical, obviously,
Sure.
but a ton of our code does look like that. And that's just so much more maintainable.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is our thesis, at least, um, that years from now, when we have to go back and work on this stuff, hey, it looks exactly like the spec, and now the spec changed in this way, so I know exactly where to change it and how. And I don't have to figure out like, oh, here's an interpretation of that spec. How does this spec change map to this interpretation?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's also sort of a strong motivation to use the OO paradigm, is because it allows us to do that, where we just transliterate the spec from English into um, OO programming.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, OO has lots of issues. I know that the what is it, the data oriented design people
Mm-hmm.
are very gung ho about their cache lines and data locality and whatnot. And they have a lot of good points about that. Things go faster if you put all the data in a very good way for the CPU to access.
Mm-hmm.
They're not wrong, but it's always a compromise, I think. You have to sometimes there are sacrifices that you can make, and compromises you can make where yes, we could make this thing faster, but does it even matter?
Mm.
And for the things that don't matter, I would rather our code look like the spec than our code be data oriented and really fast.
Right, and
Um,
it sort of goes back to the thing about maintainability, where you
yeah.
could write code that is considerably faster, but if nobody understands it, right, like then you create a whole new problem for yourself.
Yeah. Or if it takes considerable effort to understand it.
Mm.
Um, because one thing that's quite awesome, actually, that I would only have dreamed of years ago,
Mhm,
is we now have people coming from other browser projects or
mhm,
from the standards bodies, and they come to our code base and they can contribute code changes to it
mhm,
immediately, because it looks just like the spec that they were editing.
mhm,
And we've had that happen many times where they just come in and hack on something. And like, for example, somebody was in there the other day who was like working on some spec changes to the HTML specification,
mhm,
and he wanted to figure out what would happen if I make this change in the spec. And he discovered that he can just prototype the change in Ladybird, and then he'll find out instantly what actually happens in practice if you
mhm,
make that
mhm.
change. Which is like, compare that to having to extrapolate mentally what happens if I make the spec change in English, um, versus like testing it in practice.
Mhm,
It's quite awesome thing. And we also have people from the W3C contributing actively to Ladybird as well, which is very cool. And all of that is, I think, possible because of the way that we've approached programming.
mhm,
I think if they had to learn like our way of doing things, they would be much less likely to put up with it.
Mhm.
Because we have no market share, we have no users, we have none of that going for us, but we have a code base that they can instantly understand.
Yeah, I guess that does make it much easier. Well, honestly, that's really cool, right? Like it maybe it's not the intention, but it kind of acts as sort of like a reference implementation of the spec in a certain way.
Yes, exactly. So, one of our friends in the W3C has called it. Uh, he doesn't say that it's currently a reference implementation, but that it could be sort of one of our sort of north stars, I
Mhm.
suppose. Something that we can aim for in the long run to be a reference implementation. And I think that's certainly something that everybody can get behind and say, well, that's a good idea. There should probably be a reference implementation of the web.
Mhm. And I
Um,
think that's sort of a if it could get to that, like a kind of like really healthy spot for things to be in, because I think like that's something that you could see a lot of like the major web companies really wanting to be involved in supporting, right? Like whether you're, even like a Google, right? Like that having something there that is a reference implementation that is useful to them as well, so they can sort of base where they're going. And maybe it's not the intention from the start, but I don't know. I do think there's definitely a lot of value in that.
yeah, I think so too. And I particularly love the idea that the spec people who have been working in the dark this whole time,
Mhm,
that they would have a platform to test out their ideas.
mhm, mhm,
That's really attractive. Um, and I will say it would be interesting to be sponsored by somebody like Google.
mm,
We're certainly open to the idea of them sponsoring us. We'll put their logo on our website and say thank you, but that's everything that they would get.
mhm.
Um, it's not currently something that that
Right,
is
right.
happening, but they wouldn't be treated any differently than anybody else. But a fun fact is that although the Google, the corporation, may not care about what we're doing at the moment,
Mhm,
many of the people working on their browsers are current sponsors of our project,
mhm,
and we actually have sponsors on all the major browser teams. So um, I think people who build browsers, they appreciate what we do.
mhm,
Um, quite strongly, and for many reasons,
mhm.
including this sort of reference implementation aspect.
Right, like the engineers are very different than corporate. The engineers,
Yes.
they want something that they know they're doing the right thing for the specification. Like it's good for them. Maybe corporate might not agree, right? Like they're like, I think people when they talk about a company, they kind of forget there is often a really big distinction between the people who are actually doing the work and the people who are running the company.
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure, for sure. And yeah, it's just one of the many different things that motivate us going forward. And
Mm,
as I was saying earlier, our motivation for doing this has evolved over time, and I expect it will continue to evolve. I really love the idea of a reference implementation of the
mm,
web. I think that would be a beautiful thing. And nobody else is really trying this. There are people trying to build new browser engines,
mm,
but they're not taking this particular approach.
mhm.
Um, yeah, who knows? We'll see what happens with that.
So one thing I did kind of want to get into is sort of the state of the browser right now. So
Mhm.
obviously it's not alpha yet. You not calling it alpha, but how usable is Ladybird as it stands?
It's surprisingly usable if you stay on the happy path of stuff that we are actively testing,
Mhm,
um, which would be things like going to the Ladybird GitHub repository and reviewing pull requests and
mhm,
filing bugs, or browsing our developers' respective local pizza places, things like that. Um, but you open it up and you go to a website that we've never heard of,
mhm.
big chance you're going to get a crash
Sure.
or something like that. And crashes, just to be clear, we don't tend to have memory safety problems because we already do have a garbage collector that protects us from the typical use after free type of problems that C++ projects tend to have.
Mhm,
So our crashes that we do get are typically like invariant violations. So like, hey, this thing is much bigger than it was supposed to ever be. Or like, why is this number here negative? It's not supposed to be negative.
mhm,
Assertion
mhm,
failure. Um, and a lot of our work on web compatibility is just like taking these kind of violation reports and just tracking down why is this happening and then fixing our engine to handle it.
mhm,
Um, but we do treat all of those things as crashes today.
mhm,
And for that reason, the browser is quite unstable because it will just throw up its hands. The moment anything happens that we're not expecting, we'll throw up our hands and say, crash, crash, please deal with me.
mhm, mhm.
So there's no like defensive programming here where we try to, like paper things over and
Right.
handle it anyway. Product that we want to release to people is obviously going to be perhaps a bit more fault tolerant, that it would, like allow some visual strangeness to happen instead
Mhm.
of crashing. But
Right, yeah. If some element can't load correctly, it just doesn't load the element. It doesn't die.
right, exactly. So that's just the kind of a I guess almost like a paradigm shift in the way we think about failure states in the browser when
Mhm,
we shift from being pre-alpha to alpha.
mhm.
Um, yeah.
When things shift into the alpha, what should the state of the browser look like at that point?
So we have sort of an internal list of websites that we want to work
Mhm,
decently well. Um, and it's like a pretty unexciting list. It's like Facebook, Instagram, uh, Twitter, the
right,
usual
right, right, right.
suspects, LinkedIn.
Probably want
We
your
want you to be
search
able
engine
to
sites to work as well.
search engine sites. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like these, major internet properties.
Sure, sure.
We haven't put YouTube on there because dealing with all the video stuff
Uh-huh.
feels like a little bit of a scary commitment. It's possible that we will get it done in time for alpha, but I don't know. We don't
Mhm.
want to commit to it because it's also like a little too much effort on a specific use case that doesn't necessarily benefit every other website.
Right.
So we'll see about that one. But the idea is that you would be able to use the major internet sites, like log in, interact with the sites in the ways that you typically do, like post your daily cringe motivation on LinkedIn or whatever,
Right, right, right.
um, and go like some photos on Instagram, that kind of stuff.
Mhm,
And outside of those sort of like real world use cases, we also have sort of list of different technical things that we want to achieve. So like we want to achieve certain um, levels of feature support for different features. We want to achieve certain optimizations so that we can be reasonably responsive. Um, but it's hard to choose exactly what we target. I have talked to all of the people working full time on it, and everybody has sort of some targets for themselves that
mhm,
they want to achieve. But then we also have a community that works on it at the same time. We have no control over what they decide that they want to make work. Um, Ultimately, though, what's really going to happen in practice is that when the time feels right, we're just going to say, "All right, this is good.
mhm,
Let's release it." Um, because we say we're going to put out an alpha in 2026. So at some point in 2026, we're just going to put it out, and hopefully we'll be able to get it into a good state before then.
mhm.
But we don't want to be one of those projects that just keeps postponing and postponing.
The last episode I just recorded was with Jahan from the GIMP project. So you want to talk about postponing and postponing? That's a great example. Um, but like what they were doing with GIMP 3, like it evolved. It was going to be a small release, and like, hey, let's redo the entire color system. Let's do this. Let's do that. And things that were going to be in 3.1, 3.2, they're like, hey, let's just do it in 3.0, and it snowballed
Right.
on from there.
Yeah. So browsers are in an interesting place with releases, though, because everybody else puts out a new version of their browser every couple of weeks,
Mhm,
right? Or maybe Safari is still a bit slower than that, but certainly Chrome and Firefox, they put out new versions very regularly.
mhm,
And that's just the nature of the business. And
mhm,
so I
mhm,
think that's what we are going to have to do as well. Um, we just have to get into the cadence of the typical browser release.
mhm.
So whatever we put out, it's not going to be fresh for that long. Like we'll have sort of continuous new alpha versions. Obviously, it's
Right.
just it's not that there's going to be like here's the alpha version. Please test it for the next year and let us know how it goes.
Mhm, mhm.
It'll probably be the alpha version for a couple of hours, maybe until the next one comes out. So alpha is more like a mindset, I would say.
Right, right.
Um, can take that clip out of context. Um,
So obviously it's it's hard to really estimate software timelines, especially for a project as big as doing a browser. But how long do
yeah.
you hope to have the alpha last for?
So we hope to be in the alpha mindset for a year,
Mhm.
and then switch to a beta mindset. Um, and
Another great clip right
an
there.
another great clip, yes. And then, of course, after another year, finally settling in the sigma mindset,
Mhm, mhm.
uh, and so on.
Yeah.
Um, no, we're hoping to do alpha for a year and beta for a year.
Okay.
The difference between the two things is not entirely clear. Just broadening the target audience, I think.
Mhm,
Making the alpha version will be like very rough.
mhm.
Developers, early adopters, and brave souls. Um, Beta version probably like a little bit of padding around the edges. Like not necessarily so pointy everywhere that you hurt yourself,
Right.
but still decidedly broken occasionally and clumsy software.
Mhm,
And our hope is that after 2 years of increasingly intense user testing and feedback, we'll be able to put out a general release that would work for the average person and have a high chance of providing them with a reasonable browser experience, let's say.
mhm. I
Yes, we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. As I said, and you've been in this industry for a very long time. Software timelines, you know,
Yeah.
no matter how many times someone has done a timeline, something's gonna happen. Projects scope's gonna expand. A job's bigger than you thought it was going to be. Yeah,
Yeah, true, true. But one beautiful thing about this is that we know exactly what it is that we're trying to build.
right.
We're just trying to build a browser. It just has to support the web. Now, the web is gigantic and it changes all the time, which is frustrating.
Mhm,
Um, but it's also like an understandable problem.
mhm,
Like it is the web. And so we're not going to be surprised, I don't think, by sudden unexpected requirements.
mhm.
I say that, of course, and then tomorrow Google comes out with virtual reality browsing, and like forget about HTML. It's all about whatever now. Um, but barring some kind of major seismic event like that,
Mhm,
um, we're expecting that the web is going to continue being the web, and we just need to get better at rendering and interacting with it.
mhm,
Um, so if the major problem that I see happening is like we're not necessarily good enough by the time we want to do a release. And I think within reason, we kind of have to accept what we're able to do and the time that we allocate for it.
mhm,
And um, as long as it's within reason, a usable thing, we want to put it out. Um, but that's something we have to evaluate over time as dates get closer.
mhm, mhm,
Um, yeah, we'll see. Um, it's very encouraging to look at where we are today. It really does feel like the major pieces are in place, but
mhm,
it needs a lot of performance and stability work. Um, but the question of like, can you build a browser? It's no longer really a question.
mhm,
It's more like, can you build a browser that's fit for an average person to use?
Right.
Um, can you polish this enough that it's like an actual software product and not just a proof of concept? Because today, as complicated as it is and as much we've invested into it, is still very much a proof of concept.
Mhm.
Um,
So as things have sort of improved, as a browser has actually been like become a browser, how have you noticed, like, I guess, vibes where people talk about the project sort of change? Where
mm,
early on, you said there were a lot of people who thought this was just impossible. You can't build a browser. How could anyone ever do that? Now there is something there, and you will show off things just kind of working. Obviously, it's very, vertical slice. Hey,
oh
here's
yeah,
the thing I know that works working. But just the fact that there are things that are working.
yeah. So attitudes have changed dramatically
Mhm,
since we started. Um, when I first started hacking on just HTML stuff in Serenity OS,
mhm.
um, people would tell me, "Yeah, sure, but you'll never be able to implement JavaScript."
Right.
Like that was the sort of mental block that people had in the beginning. That JavaScript is impossible. You can doodle with your little CSS and HTML, right? Um, and then we started building the JavaScript engine, and it relatively quickly just got stood up and started working. Um, and then they would shift to something else, and there's been this continuous shifting of the goalposts. Um,
Mhm,
Whenever we succeed at something, people, the haters, inevitably come and say like, "Oh yeah, well, that's not really a browser though, because a real browser can browse YouTube or can do like video calls or whatever they decided a real browser can do."
mhm, mhm.
Um, and there's just like been a type of person that always finds some reason that it's not a real browser. Um, but I have noticed that in the beginning there were a lot of those people, and they had relatively low thresholds for what
Mm.
was possible.
Right.
And over time, now it's like only the most hardcore haters remain. Um,
Eventually, it's gonna
and
be,
yeah,
well, oh, you can't have a reasonable security update cycle. It's like, how you've got a browser that works and it browses the entire web, no issues. But, oh well, if there's some vulnerability discovered, you can't get that out in a reasonable amount of time.
right. Yeah, exactly. Like this tiny little things, or essentially like it's only real browser if it's from the Bay Area region of California, right? Like otherwise it's just sparkling JavaScript.
Right, right.
Um, and I'm sure there's going to be those people in the end,
Sure, yeah.
but you can't please them. I don't
As I
think,
said
and we
earlier,
don't
you
we don't
can't
need to.
reason with the unreasonable.
Yeah, exactly.
Like there are just people
Yeah.
who they want to see things fail. Like they don't really know
Mhm.
why or what they want to see fail, but they just want to see something fail.
Yes, there are certainly those people, um, and a lot of what we get late.
Oh, did we DC? We went 2 hours. Oh, we good? Yes, we're back.
Hello, are we back?
Almost 2 hours without a DC.
Nice.
Almost there. Okay, sorry.
We're still on.
Yes, we're good now.
Okay. Right. So where was I going? I was thinking about these people who are skeptics,
Mm,
and one of the things that we've been hearing is that it's just too expensive. Like even if you have the technical chops to do something like this, you just can't pay for it.
mm,
Um, And I've been telling those people that just because Google throws $1 billion at projects like this doesn't mean that you have to do that. Like there might be other ways to do it, right? And that's what we're trying to prove, that you can do it with a smaller budget, smaller team.
mhm.
And now that we're showing pretty good progress with that approach, those people have also chilled out a little bit. Like they're not complaining about the money anymore. And the most recent stuff I get is more like, I don't like some of the technical decisions that you've made, like why this language? Why object-oriented programming? Like, why do you this? Why that? Why not Zig or whatever?
Of course.
Um, Yeah, so now it's like people have almost accepted the idea that you can build one of these things, and they just wanna argue about technical details,
Mhm.
which I guess is a pretty big achievement
Yeah.
of sorts. Um, we've managed to go from, like, "This cannot possibly be done," to, "I don't like your coding style." Um, I'll take it, you know?
Yeah, no, I agree. Like that's a great place to be in, and you said you've been involved in emulators in the past as well, and that's sort of the same idea, right? Like I'm sure the guys who work on RPCS3, the PS3 emulator, like early on, people like there's no way you can emulate a PS3. How could you ever deal with the cell processor? Well,
Yep, I've heard that for sure. I don't think I ever said it, but I certainly when I first heard about the PS3, I remember thinking like, I don't think this would ever get emulated.
mhm,
So I can see where people were coming from, being skeptical,
mhm,
but life finds a way,
mhm.
as they say in the Jurassic Park, and that might be a bit of an old movie actually these days. I don't know if people get that reference, um, but life does find a way
Mhm.
to emulate all these things because it's just the unstoppable force of the highly focused nerd who wants to do something with his computer.
Mhm,
Like,
mhm.
you don't want to get in the way of that because they'll find a way.
Yeah, if
And
you have a Turing complete language and the problem is possible, someone's gonna do it.
someone is going to do it. Yeah. It may be like years of painstaking effort, but it's going to happen.
Mhm.
Um, and you look at the current gen consoles like PS5, and we can say the same thing, like, "Oh, this will never be emulated on consumer PC or whatever." But like, of course it will.
Well, actually,
Um,
with that one, it's actually really easy with the current ones because they're just x86 PCs. Like it's the easiest it's
yeah.
ever been to do it.
Yeah, well, okay, I'm a little out of touch with that business now, actually. I don't even know what's in a PS5. So there you go. It's even easy now.
Mhm. Well, now you have the DRM problems. That's a whole separate issue.
Yeah, okay. So DRM, and like let's also say something like that sounds a little more out there. So like an electric vehicle, right? Like
Mm,
there are these proprietary electric vehicles. Like surely nobody will ever be able to like just build one of those in their garage. Um, that's just too much,
mm,
but who knows? Um,
yeah.
Like, whenever we talk about things like this, and then you fast forward 20 years, and there's, like, a high schooler doing it. So, I think we should just cool it on the XYZ is impossible thing because you always end up with egg on your face.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, I will going back to what I've said about Linus. I think people forget that he was a first year university student when he started the Linux kernel. He
Okay.
in the early in there's some early stories of him working on it, and he didn't know how to use um he didn't know how to write a function that took a variable length a variable number of options. Like that's
Mhm.
how early he was in programming when he started that project. So yeah, like yeah, obviously the hardware was a lot simpler back then. It was a very different time, but someone did it. And again, if you're dealing with a problem that is possible and you have a Turing complete language and somebody has the motivation, like yeah, it can be done, so it probably will be done at some point.
Yeah, yeah, I think so, and something I would love to see is that now that we show people that you can do this,
Mm.
I would love it if more people do.
Mm.
And these people who want to argue about coding style or perhaps more important technical decisions, if they have better ideas for how to do this, go and try to do it. Um, it's not as hard as it might seem.
Mhm.
Um, and certainly, if people want to fork what we're doing in the future, like who knows what happens with that,
Mhm.
we would like to have built something that people could continue in a different way if many people feel that that would be good.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, like lowering or raising the baseline, I guess, is what we're trying to do for
Mhm.
what's possible.
I think it's not an important thing at all, but there's one last thing I probably should ask about. The name Ladybird, or
Mhm.
as people in my comments seem to say, Ladybug, or one guy said Ladyboy, which is definitely that one's definitely wrong. But Ladybug, I'm sure you get
Right.
quite often.
Mm, yes, Americans are very confused by the concept of a ladybird insect.
Yes, yes they are.
Um, and not just not just average internet commenters. I've actually had a lawyer ask us if we can't get the name Ladybird, would we consider changing it to Woman Bird? Um, which is a very bizarre question.
Yeah,
Uh,
but yeah,
anyway,
why is that? why why is that the name? Not the woman bird, but ladybird.
right. So the history of the name is that a ladybird insect,
Mhm,
some Americans call them ladybugs.
mhm, mhm,
Um, it was the mascot of the SerenityOS project since its early conception. And the name comes from the um, nickname of my wife in Hungarian,
mhm.
which is ladybird in Hungarian, Katica. Um, and so I just put a bunch of ladybirds everywhere in SerenityOS just as a reference to my wife, and then the name sort of just came along from there. Um,
Yeah.
so that's the great mystery.
Mhm. Fair, fair enough. Fair enough. Like some projects, there's projects like OBS where it's just named the thing it does, the Open Broadcaster Software. Then you have
Yeah,
projects where it's like, hey, like Linux, where it's named after Linus, even though he didn't exactly want that. It was going to be called Freaks. I'm very happy that didn't
right.
happen. Um, and then names
That
just
would have
come
been lame.
I'm sure we'd get so many repeated jokes because of it. So many very overdone jokes if it was called Freaks.
True, true. I will say that there's a subtle
Mm,
reference to something in the name, which is the bird suffix.
mm,
The reason that I went with ladybird and not ladybug is twofold. It's because ladybug, calling a software something bug feels a
yeah,
bit like
yeah,
this is not great.
yeah, yeah.
And also, it's a little bit of a reference to the original name for Firefox, which was Firebird. Um, but they
Right.
had to change that because there was a conflict with a database engine or something, I think.
Mm,
Um, and they got into this heated argument about like search engine optimization or whatever
mm, mm,
back in the day. And I was a user of Firebird way back when, and I thought that's a cool name. And
mm,
so um, that was something that I thought about when we ended up calling it Ladybird. Is like continuing that
mm,
something bird vibe from so long ago.
mm,
Thunderbird, I suppose, has
mm,
existed
mm.
this whole time because they used to be complementary names like Firebird and Thunderbird. Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
in the very early versions, they actually had a bird logo.
right. Indeed. I think even before that, it was called Phoenix, which I
Yes.
guess was like,
Point one was Phoenix, yes, and then it became Firebird at some point after that. Not exactly sure what version, but yes. That I'm seeing the logo. That is such a that is you like logo designers would cry seeing this thing. It was clearly like it's a product of the time.
yes.
Um,
Well, if you look at Firebird from the time, like
mm,
the
mm,
user interface icons and everything, it's a very like just after Windows XP kind of
mm,
vibe.
mm.
Um,
I realized there was one more
yeah.
thing I hadn't actually asked you about, and that was you did bring it up before, but extensions. And I know you've
Mhm.
probably been asked hundreds of times, like, "Hey, when are you going to support extensions? When can you use uBlock Origin, Bitwarden, whatever it is people want?" What is the plan for extensions?
So they're not in our alpha schedule. It's not
Mm.
something we're actively working on because we are having a hard enough time getting the web to render
Sure,
correctly at all.
sure.
But we all use extensions ourselves, and we all have extensions that we love and we want them to work.
Mhm.
And so our long-term ambition is to support the popular extensions that people care about.
Mhm.
Like uBlock Origin or whatever is the most popular AdBlock extension,
Mhm.
and the other things that people like, sponsor block, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, and as browser developers, we're also very keen on there are these extensions that like take the whole page and save it as a single HTML file. Um,
Yeah.
it's very, very handy. So probably gonna support those as well. But yeah, we just want to support the browser extensions that people care about the most. Um, and we have absolutely no incentive to restrict your ability to build a super complicated ad blocker if you want to, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I don't know what that will look like because we're not actively working on it today,
Sure.
and it depends a bit on what the extension landscape looks like. Perhaps, let's say, a year or two from now.
Mhm.
But whatever is popular, we want to support it.
Mhm.
Today, nothing is supported.
Mhm.
What we do have is very rudimentary ad blocking built in, which is you can just make a filter list where we like refuse to load. If a URL matches this regular expression, then we don't load it.
Right.
Basically, like
Okay.
that's what we have.
Mhm.
Um, none of the fancy stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
But yeah, um, and I think I just want to make it clear that Ladybird, as it exists today, it's not really suitable for end users.
Sure, sure.
Um, and I feel like I've been implying this the whole time that we've been talking. I just want to say it very clearly that, like, if you are an end user, not a developer with no ambitions of getting into browser development, you will be disappointed by Ladybird if you try it out today.
Mhm.
Um, you might have a bad time getting it to build, and then you will certainly have a bad time getting it to work. Um, so please just give us a chance to build it up and give you a good first impression.
Mhm. Okay. I think I've hit on pretty much everything I wanted to touch on here. If there's anything else you wanted to mention, otherwise, yeah, we can start signing off from there.
Yeah, so I guess what I'll mention is that we're always looking for more developers to work
If
on our
people want to
project.
get involved, where's the best place they can go?
You can go to ladybird.org and you will find links to our GitHub repository, to our Discord server where we coordinate development and hang out all day.
Mhm.
Um, and the best way to join, or the best way to start development, um, it varies depending on what your interests are.
Mhm.
But generally, if you like test-driven development, you can find a test to work on. If you like compatibility with the web, you can find a web page that doesn't work and then try to figure out why. We have guided many, many people through the process of getting started with this. So just join the Discord and come chat. And if anybody's listening who's interested in sponsoring this effort, we are always seeking new sponsors, both corporate and individual. And you find information about that on ladybird.org as well.
Awesome. Anything else you would like to mention? Like maybe anything else? You mentioned sponsors. You mentioned getting involved. Nothing else. You do. You'd also do the stuff on YouTube, don't you? You have like updates.
Sure. Yeah, we have a Ladybird YouTube channel where we post at the end of every month. We post like a little update about what we've been doing in the last month and give a little bit of presentation and a visual demo of new features and stuff.
Mhm.
So just to give you an idea of where we are, they usually run between 15-20 minutes, something like that.
They're like
Um,
graphs. There's a number of graphs in them.
yes, we like to put graphs in them and try to mix it up a little bit. And yeah, people generally enjoy those to just give you an idea of how things are going. Um, and they are unedited. So if something doesn't work, you get to see it not working,
Mhm.
because we try to be transparent with that. Um, but for the most part, things do work in the demos. So yeah, come check that out on I think it's at Ladybird Browser on YouTube.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll leave all of those links down below. You guys are also over on X or Twitter, whatever you want to call it, as well. So that'll be in the description as well.
Mm.
Yeah. Is that all of the things that people should know about?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, if you're interested in learning anything else or want to talk about these topics, come hang out on Discord. There's always somebody ready to answer your questions.
Awesome. Okay. As for my stuff, my main channel is Brody Robertson. I do Linux videos there 6 days a week. I at some point when the alpha's out, I'll probably do a stream, and it's probably going to crash 100 times because that's what tends to happen when I mess around with alpha software. I'm having a lot of fun doing the. I've done probably 20 or 30 hours dedicated bug testing of Cosmic. It's very fun. I do not recommend. I do not recommend testing your desktop environment that's alpha on the hardware you're recording on. It tends to go very badly.
Mhm.
I should do it on a virtual machine. I don't. So yeah. The gaming channel is Brody on Games. I stream there twice a week. Right now I'm playing through Ender Magnolia and Stranger Paradise. There's the React channel, Brody Robertson Reacts. I upload clips over there if you want to see clips of stuff. The audio version of this can be found on Spotify and every podcast platform. There is an RSS feed. If you search Tech of a T, you will find it. If you like to see the video version, it is on YouTube. The video is also on Spotify if you like Spotify video. In case anyone uses that. I don't know why, but they have a thing that sorts it. Yeah, I'll give you the final word. What do you want to say? How do you want to sign us off?
I guess I'll just say thank you for having me on, Brody. It's
Absolute pleasure.
a very lovely conversation, and I think you made me think about a lot of interesting stuff about how we position ourselves going forward into the future.
Mhm.
It's something that it's easy to forget about when we're just focusing on the day-to-day technical details,
Mhm.
and um, it's going to be really exciting, I think, to see once you start testing our alpha. I'm definitely going to be watching and cringing every time it crashes. Um, so
I will probably have a couple of drinks by my side as well, so yeah, we'll see how that goes.
yeah, but I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome.
No, yeah, thank you for having me on.
No, it was an absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed this. And yeah, I learned a lot about the project. I had like a cursory understanding of it, but it's really good to see sort of how this is progressing. And yeah, if whenever you want to come back on, we can do this again. Maybe when you're close to the alpha or the alpha's out. Yeah, I'd be happy to do this anytime in the future.
Love to.
Awesome. And